So hi, everyone. My name is Victoria, and I am the lead organizer of today's symposium. And it is my pleasure to introduce you and welcome you to Humanities Session 5. We have three amazing presenters today. And so I'll give you a little sneak peek as to how this will work. So all three presenters will be sharing their screen and going through their presentation. And at the end of all three presentations, we will do one big Q&A. And so if you have any questions as they pop up to you, there's this handy little Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will go through that all together at the end. So post your questions for any of the presenters, and we will answer them then. Our first presenter is Fatema. So I am going to allow her to share her screen and we can begin.
Can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, my name is Fatema, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my project, Eichmann and Us, Differences in Moral Responsibility and Reasoning. So I'm going to begin with my research question, which is being normal, rational, moderately reasons responsive, following the law, and acting out of good intention enough to prevent us from severe moral transgression? So to start with, I'm going to go over what exactly I mean by these terms. So by normality, I mean someone who is the ordinary average person, someone who reasonably follows the social and moral norms of their community. Rationality would be the ability to appropriately process information through reason and to make decisions based on clear thought and rationale. While moderate reasons responsiveness would be someone whose psychological mechanism exhibits regularity with respect to its receptivity to reasons. Now, most people around us showcase the above characteristics and don't seem to be perpetuating any major harm. But as I'm going to show now, it might not be so straightforward. So to test my research question of whether being in possession of traits of rationality, following the law, and acting out of good intent is enough to prevent us from transgressing morally, we're going to look at the case of Adolf Eichmann. So Eichmann was a Nazi officer in charge of running the trains that transported Jewish people to concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And Eichmann in Jerusalem, the book you see here, is a report on his trial by Hannah Arendt. Now, the interesting part about Eichmann's case is that he managed to participate in the oppressive system of Nazi Germany while simultaneously being a completely normal, ordinary, rational person, not indoctrinated in any way, and with a seeming lack of malice or ill will towards Jewish people. His normality was in fact established at the beginning of the trial by the court psychologist, who proclaimed him to be more normal at any rate than I am after having examined him. He also constantly reiterated that he was merely carrying out orders and doing what was asked of him. He personally had nothing against Jewish people and had never willed the murder of human beings. He was also following the law of the land, since Hitler's orders were validated by regulations and directives drafted by expert lawyers and legal advisors, paving the way for his orders to be treated as law. So we can see that Eichmann fulfills some key criteria in order to be held morally responsible. He's completely sane, normal, rational, and sufficiently responsive to reasons, but clearly only being in possession of these characteristics, following the law, and acting out of good intention did not prevent him from transgressing morally. Now, it's intuitive to think that we're different from Eichmann, but we may actually be more similar than we think. So to start, we all presumably possess the above-mentioned traits of rationality and take ourselves to be law-abiding and acting out of good intention. In fact, just like him, we too manage to unwittingly perpetuate harm despite being in possession of these characteristics. So if you take the example of systemic racial injustice or climate change, simply being not racist isn't enough, because even if you are not racist, you may still benefit from systems around you that are built on the oppression of people of color. And to then carry on without active interruption of a racist system is to be complicit in racism. Similarly, driving a gas car, engaging in the consumption of fast fashion, and consuming meat or dairy are all seemingly small individual actions that unwittingly contribute to the larger problem of climate change. So clearly, just like Eichmann, we do manage to perpetuate harm despite acting in good faith, being in possession of traits of rationality and following the law. There is, however, a difference between us and Eichmann when it comes to causal power. His actions had a far more widespread and immediate contribution to the extermination of Jewish people in Nazi Germany than the average citizens have to exacerbating climate change. But nonetheless, there is some form of causal contribution, and that is enough for us to plausibly be held responsible. So if we are like Eichmann in this way, what can we do then to ensure we don't transgress morally in a way similar to his? So I propose engaging in dialogue with people outside of our moral communities and being open to a criticism of our values, by which we can become more aware of the moral implications of our actions. So doing this serves as an important epistemic check against the kind of knowledge we already possess and by which we measure our actions, and helps to foster skills that prove vital in differentiating us from Eichmann, namely critical thinking, the ability to be aware of and analyze our social conditioning, and the ability to empathize with people who have different identities and experiences from us. There has to be, however, an active individual commitment to seeking out dialogue and to having honest interactions with each other. This potentially increases, a good strategy for this would be to seek out conversations with people with whom we share similar identities, but differ in the moral communities we inhabit or vice versa. So this potentially increases the probability that along with differing on certain values, the people interacting will find something they have in common, leading them to understanding and bridging the gap between their differences. So to better understand the effects of dialogue in real-world settings, I drew on the qualitative research of Edie Marie Weitzman, whose doctoral thesis chronicles the experience of campers at Seeds of Peace. So Seeds of Peace International Camp is a camp that takes place in the US over the summer and started in 1993. It brings teenagers from different conflict areas around the world to engage in facilitated dialogue in a traditional summer camp setting. So there are teenagers from Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, the US, the UK, Jordan, and Egypt. And dialogue discusses stereotypes, prejudice, conflict, identity, and more. One dialogue group consists of 12 people and is conducted for 90 minutes every day. So in this 3-week program, campers have challenging dialogue sessions where they discuss common historical events, are exposed to a narrative other than the one they've heard before, and learn to challenge their understanding of right and wrong. These conversations that they have can be daunting and hard, but by the end of the 3 weeks, campers leave with a deeper sense of empathy for people from the other side of the conflict and a willingness to continue engaging in conversations that help challenge their perspective. So a 2014 study that quantitatively tracked how the Seeds of Peace intervention affected Israelis and Palestinians' relationships and attitudes towards each other found increased positivity towards the outgroup from pre-camp to post-camp. And data collected from surveys across 3 years found that 64.2% of participants from a close personal friendship with someone from the outgroup, and 67.5% of Palestinians made an outgroup friend compared to 61% of Israelis. Now, a dialogue program like Seeds of Peace that takes place in the US away from the conflict in a neutral setting comes with the re-entry problem, where after mediating conflict in a neutral setting, returning to the original environment that propagates stereotypes can result in a lapse back into old ways of thinking. However, the 2014 study I cited earlier found that although the positivity in attitudes towards the outgroup faded after participants returned to their home countries, there remained a significant increase compared to attitudes prior to the intervention start. So these results suggest that the re-entry problem is real, but that it may not undermine all of the long-term effects of the intervention. Upon returning home, there's also a reinforcement of the unequal treatment of the parties due to the extended conflict situation in the real world. Treating both sides at camp equally would be misleading without acknowledging the unequal power dynamic that's present in the dialogue space and outside. So facilitating intergroup contact that makes members aware of these power inequalities enables them to interact with the other side with awareness and no longer mindlessly act out the power dynamics present. It's also important to ask what the goals are for each party participating in dialogue. For the party in a position of power, the outcome may be critical thinking and empathy towards the weaker party. But what is the desired outcome for the side that isn't in a position of power? So to facilitate more equitable dialogue, there should be a focus on a categorized approach where national identity is central and there's an emphasis on intergroup relations and not only interpersonal ones. The aim of having dialogue then moves from understanding the experience of the other side to helping each person identify their position in the conflict and then take action in their respective communities to bridge the inequities between the opposing groups. So dialogue for us might not look the same as it does for Israelis and Palestinians, but while it might take a different form according to the different interactions available to us and the different systems we contribute to, the basic principles of committing to understanding the implications of our actions and being open to a criticism of our values remain the same, hopefully helping us to look beyond merely the law and our traits of rationality as means to safeguard our actions from blame. I'd like to just end by thanking my mentor, Daniel, for helping me with this project. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Fatima. I see we got a few questions for you in the Q&A. So at the end of all of our presentations, we'll go through all of the questions, but wonderful job. I'm now going to hand it over to Riya. And great.
Thank you very much. It was the October of 1962 when the resourced and prepared troops from the People's Republic of China entered Indian held territory. President Kennedy ordered an emergency airlift of supplies to the Indian Army. At the same time, he engaged in diplomatic talks that kept the neighboring country Pakistan out of the fighting. He indulged India in extensive military aid and was credited as a key figure in defusing the situation. Hello, I'm Riya Nagar. Today, I will be presenting the research I am doing with my mentor Dilyara about the factors affecting JFK's foreign policy and dynamic relationship with India. US's critical assistance to India in the 1962 Sino-Indian War is one of the many highlights in US-India relations during the Kennedy term. Other examples of US generosity and creation of cordial relations with India include a hand in the creation of the Tarapur nuclear plant, establishment of the Peace Corps in India, the appointment of one of the most brilliant economic minds of the 21st century, John Kenneth Galbraith, as US ambassador to India, and a $1 billion aid package. My research, at its core, in its most elemental form, asks and answers the question, why? Why, during 1961 and 1962, had US expressed preference for India like it never had before and would not in the years to come? To answer this question, I examine the factors that shaped the US-India relationship during the Kennedy term. I suggest that the influence and expertise of John Kenneth Galbraith as US ambassador to India in 1961 and 1962, the threat of Chinese communist sphere of influence, JFK's personal relationship with Prime Minister Nehru are all influencing and major factors shaping the US-India relationship during the Kennedy term. On to methodology and literature. The methodology in this research project focuses on the close reading of three primary sources. First, the Ambassador's Journal, a legendary source that provides a detailed account of bilateral ties and what it means to be an American diplomat serving overseas in the 60s. Second, the US and Indian newspapers from the 1960s describing the crisis. And third, official correspondence between the US and Indian heads of state, JFK and Nehru. Now moving on to the three factors. I argue that the US ambassador to India, John Kenneth Galbraith, is a major influencing figure in strengthening US-Indian relations at the time. It can be seen multiple times in his personal diary, The Ambassador's Journal, that his opinion is greatly valued by President Kennedy and that he has a direct ear to the president. The Galbraith factor can be largely elaborated by instances of Galbraith's influence. These instances, such as the president reading Galbraith's personal letters to him about foreign policy and Galbraith's views on the ongoings of India, reflect Galbraith's personal influence on the president. Galbraith found a great economic potential in the country and developed a passion towards Indian culture after his many visits there. An example of the magnitude of his involvement in the US-India relations is his primary role in getting the First Lady, Mrs. Kennedy, to visit India in 1962. This was an action as described by scholar Bruce Rydell in his book JFK's Forgotten Crisis as the savior of previously strained US-India relations. Galbraith was deeply respected by Indian Prime Minister Nehru, and during the 1962 Sino-Indian War, Galbraith took full control of the situation, engaged in diplomacy with the Indians, and formulated a border policy, which is in effect to this day. I also argue that China's sphere of influence, its dealings with the USSR, and overall communist configuration constitute the second factor in shaping US-Indian relations. Perhaps the most representative explanation of US, India, and China dynamics can be stated in the words of President Kennedy himself. India follows a route in keeping with human dignity and individual freedom, with only haphazard assistance from this country. Red China represents the route of regimented controls and ruthless denial of human rights, with considerable aid from the USSR. This must change. JFK built on the policies of previous US presidents to reduce the presence of communist China in the region. But he went beyond, and he sought to empower India as a central democratic nation against the growing spread of Red China. Lastly, I argue that the complex personal relationship between the two heads of state, JFK, and Nehru are also influencing factors in the US-India relations during the early 1960s. My main evidence comes from correspondence between the two during their terms. Nehru and JFK, despite having personal tensions, rose to create one of the most successful periods of US-India relations. Their example represents the importance and the idea of foreign policy of a country being representative of the heads of state. Now that I have finished with explaining the three factors, I'm going to answer a very important question, one that's undoubtedly on many of your minds. Why is this relevant? How does my research matter? My research focuses on the nature of US-India relations and crisis diplomacy. These are two concepts that are just as important in the present as they were in the past. Kennedy has undoubtedly been a major shaping factor in US-India relations. The US relationship with India declined in the years after his presidency. I suggest that Kennedy's foreign policy towards India is a framework that would be of great use to American presidents. His crisis diplomacy in the Sino-Indian War is a crucial example, as to this day, India and China continue to have border conflicts. During the latest dispute in 2020, which claimed the life of many Indian soldiers, JFK's handling of the situation all those years ago came back into focus, and his example and diplomacy model will be crucial in the forthcoming conflicts too. My research contributes to setting forth a roadmap for modern cooperation, which would be historic and beneficial for these two great nations. It is important now more than ever that these two democracies with vast promise and potential overcome the hesitations of history. Presently, I intend to finish and publish my research paper. In the future, I plan to analyze US-India relations in greater detail, not only a singular period, but the entire timeline. I hope to make my impact in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Riya, for that wonderful presentation. That was really informative. And as someone who knew nothing about US-India relations, I feel like I know a little bit. So great job. Let me unpin you. And then we can move to our final presenter of this session, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, are you able to now share your screen?
Yes. I can't start my video though.
Oh, okay. I just sent you a request to start it.
Oh yes, thank you.
Of course.
So oh wait, shoot, sorry, wrong slide. Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, so today I'll be talking to you about a few of the risk factors of Alzheimer's disease and also the impact that someone's socioeconomic status has on the rest of the risk factors. So first, I'll briefly touch on some key aspects of AD. AD is the most common form of dementia, and it's a progressive neurological disease that diminishes the brain's ability to form memories, control thoughts, and process language. So in AD, toxins called beta amyloid and tau aggregate in the brain and disrupt neural connections while also damaging neurons. And that leads to brain death. And you can see in the image here that a healthy neuron is attacked by amyloid beta plaques and hyperphosphorylated tau, which is called tau tangles. And that cuts off neurons' connections, and which leads to global brain death or brain atrophy. So this brain death leads to the symptoms of AD, which are often mood and behavioral changes, confusion, difficulty speaking, memory loss, and difficulty orienting oneself in time and space. And the onset of the symptoms, so like what time they appear in somebody's life, is affected by the risk factors that I'll go over shortly, and also by something called cognitive reserve. And what cognitive reserve is basically the capacity of a healthy brain to maintain its function in the context of aging and disease. So what this means is that somebody with less cognitive reserve will have AD symptoms much earlier in their life than somebody with a lot of cognitive reserve. And as we'll see in a bit, cognitive reserve is primarily affected by education. So let's get into the risk factors right now. So age is by far the most important risk factor for AD, as most people who develop this disease are over 65 years old. And this is because as individuals age, their body changes, and they also lose synapses and neurons in their brain, which leads to a decrease in cognitive reserve, which, as we talked about earlier, can accentuate the symptoms of AD. Several genetic factors also contribute to the amount of amyloid beta in the brain. So the primary gene is the amyloid precursor protein, which is found on chromosome 21. And the APP protein has 25 mutations that cause an increased accumulation of amyloid beta, but it also has a mutation that actually protects against AD, and that's called the A673T mutation. And then another gene that can affect the risk of developing AD is the ApoE gene. And many researchers call the ApoE gene the strongest genetic risk factor for AD because it can either increase or decrease the risk of developing AD depending on the genetic allele of that individual. So of the 3 alleles, 2, 3, and 4, the 4th allele is by far the most dangerous one, as individuals who have just one of these alleles are 3 to 7 times more likely to develop AD. And if someone is homozygous for the 4th allele, meaning that they have 2 of them, their chance of developing AD increases by 12, and they are also more likely to develop the disease earlier in their life. Individuals with the 3rd allele are less likely to develop AD than those with the 4th allele, but still more likely to develop AD than those with the 2nd allele. And those with the 2nd allele are lucky because it not only delays the onset of AD, but also reduces the risk of developing AD by up to 40%, even if the carrier is only heterozygous for the 2nd allele. And another gene that affects the risk of developing AD is the presenilin-1 gene, which is a protein that actually increases the production of amyloid beta from the APP protein. So therefore, people with the PSEN1 gene are more likely to develop AD than people without this gene. So now, age and genetics are some risk factors that can't be controlled, but one factor that you can control is your health, specifically your cardiovascular health. So in essence, the brain needs enough blood flow to have enough oxygen and to clear toxins like amyloid beta and tau. If this blood flow is reduced, the brain doesn't receive enough nutrients and accumulates waste, which increases the risk of inflammatory processes that may contribute to amyloid beta aggregation. So the first thing that can affect blood flow to the brain is high blood pressure or hypertension. So studies have shown that individuals with hypertension are more at risk for cognitive decline. And this is because high blood pressure leads to damaged blood vessels, which leads to poor circulation and then therefore less blood flow to the brain. Another factor that affects your cardiovascular health is smoking. So interestingly enough, some studies have found that nicotine, which is found in most cigarettes, is actually protective against AD. However, you should still not smoke because smoking causes inflammation in blood vessels and also restricts blood flow, which increases the risk of developing AD. And also some studies have shown that the more somebody smokes, the more amyloid beta plaques they have, and therefore a higher risk of AD they have. So obesity is also very important to your risk of AD. Studies have shown that the more obese you are, the more at risk you are of developing AD. And this is for a multitude of reasons. One of them being you don't exercise as much, which like decreases blood flow. And there are other reasons too that I can get into if anyone is interested. But studies have also shown that being underweight is just as damaging and also increases the risk of AD. So type 2 diabetes comes with insulin resistance, which can lead to an increase in inactivation of a kinase called GSK3 beta, which increases the hyperphosphorylation of tau. And also some studies have shown that diabetes reduces hippocampal size, meaning that it takes away cognitive reserve. So to combat all of these negative risk factors, here is a positive one: exercise. So exercise has been shown to improve circulation and reduce inflammation, resulting in a healthier brain and therefore a lower risk of AD. So now for sleep. We all heard sleep is very important, and this will just prove it again. So while sleeping, the brain is very active, and some recent studies have shown that there's this thing called the lymphatic system that's responsible for clearing away waste products, including amyloid beta, from the brain. So the lymphatic system consists of para-arterial spaces that surround blood vessels. So think a tube within a tube. And these tubes allow for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid in and out of the brain, clearing away waste products like amyloid beta. So the lymphatic system is most active during slow wave sleep, which is the portion of non-rapid eye movement sleep characterized by high amplitude, low frequency brain waves. So this means that the less sleep somebody gets, the more amyloid beta builds up, and therefore that individual has a higher risk of AD. In addition, as amyloid beta builds up in the brain, slow wave sleep is disturbed. And this leads to a cycle where a lack of sleep makes more amyloid beta build up, and more amyloid beta causes a lack of sleep. And it goes on and on and on, and it gets worse and worse. Some studies have shown that if an individual has Alzheimer's disease, they're more likely to have sleeping problems as well because of this cycle. And you can kind of see more in depth how the lymphatic system works here. So you can see cerebral spinal fluid comes in through para-arterial spaces, so like the tubes within the tubes, clears away waste, and then flows out of the brain. So as previously discussed, cognitive reserve is primarily affected by a person's education level. The reason for this is that more years of education is associated with larger brain volume and more connections between synapses. So it kind of provides some redundancy. So if you have Alzheimer's disease and amyloid plaques block out one connection between your synapses, your neurons can take another path to get to the same information. So that being said, the amount of education does not affect the amount of amyloid beta or tau in the brain. It only decreases the risk of AD through providing protection in the form of cognitive reserve. So therefore, more schooling and education, which includes independent learning outside of school and work, can lower the risk of developing AD. And finally, socioeconomic status. So while socioeconomic status may at first seem unrelated to AD, it actually has a very, very large impact on the risk of developing the disease. So first, I'll define low socioeconomic status as low income and residents in disadvantaged areas. So many studies have found that people with a higher socioeconomic status have a better quality of life. And this is because they have more access to healthier food, clean air, exercise, and better healthcare. So this results in people of high SES having better diets and cardiovascular health, which can both lead to a lower risk of developing AD. In addition, studies have found that low SES can take away the quality of life that people with high SES enjoy. And in addition, these studies have also shown that people with low SES may be less likely to utilize healthcare, even if they do have access to it. So the reasons for this phenomenon may be the cost, because especially here in the United States, healthcare costs a lot, especially if you don't have insurance. So maybe people with low SES think that it's not worth it to pay that much money to get healthcare. So in addition, studies have found that people with low SES tend to have fewer years of education and greater levels of depression. And so lower education fewer years of education can lead to a decreased cognitive reserve. So therefore, all of these, all of these things aggregate, and results in people of lower SES having a much higher risk of developing AD. So in summary, genetics and age play a large role in an individual's risk for AD. Poor cardiovascular health leads to an increased risk of AD. Sleep and the lymphatic system are instrumental in clearing away amyloid beta. Education affects intelligence and cognitive reserve, both of which play a role in the likelihood of developing AD. And finally, those of low socioeconomic status are much more at risk of developing AD. And this means that much more work needs to be done so that these disadvantaged people have the same risk of developing AD as those with higher SES. Because I believe that the amount of money you have should not determine your quality of life. So thank you. And I guess you can ask questions.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was such a wonderful presentation, and I especially loved all of the purple graphics. That was really cool. So we have a lot of questions for our three presenters. I'm just going to go in order of when they were asked. So to start from the top, can we all turn on our cameras just so you guys can be seen? Great. Okay. So first question is for Fatema. How do we craft guidelines for engaging in dialogue appropriately with people who are from different moral communities?
That's a really good question. So I talk a lot more about seeds and just the dialogue process in general in my paper. But I had the privilege of going to Seeds of Peace in 2019. So a lot of the experience I'm familiar with. So when you have dialogue and you sit in your dialogue group, one of the first things you do in your first dialogue session is create dialogue norms. And these norms aren't rules, so they're not compulsory, but they're norms which kind of guide your behavior in dialogue. So an example of a norm like this would be to agree to disagree, or active listening, or step in, step out, which would mean being cognizant of the space you're taking up. So if you've been sharing whatever you want to share for a while, stepping back and letting someone else take up space. So these kind of norms, they're like put up on our like dialogue hut. So you're reminded of them and you use them to guide your behavior when you're interacting with people inside a dialogue space.
Great. And I have a quick follow-up question on that. So when you have these norms that are posted and shared with everyone as part of the camp, are you responsible for checking your fellow camp members when they don't follow the norms?
Yeah, you can always say like a gentle reminder to be, and our facilitators always remind us, like, make sure you're following the norms. Like, also because these norms are created by the participants in dialogue, so they're our norms really. So creating these norms is also an added responsibility to following them. So yeah, that's definitely yes.
Great. Okay, great. So next question also for you, Fatema. What do we do when dialogue seems to involve irresolvable disagreement? Can people always engage in fruitful communication?
So I have a couple of sections to answering this. So one is that there is definitely something to say for like the unforced force of the better argument. What extent people can reasonably decide on what the best argument is or what the best thing to follow is. But the aim of dialogue really isn't to come to a conclusion and to agree. Dialogue is more of a long process. It doesn't end when you step out of a dialogue space, and it definitely doesn't end when you stop engaging with someone. The conversations you have in dialogue stick with you for a while. So the aim of dialogue really isn't to agree, and disagreeing is a big part of engaging in dialogue, but it's more about the change in your patterns of thinking that take place when you're asked questions you don't really have an answer to, when someone asks you a question you've never been asked before. And so you're forced to consider a different opinion. And that in itself manifests itself outside, like asking those same questions outside in your real world, challenging the status quo, challenging the narrative you've been exposed to all your life and seeking a different one. So all of those things manifest in different ways. And so, yeah, there is definitely something to say to disagreements. Disagreements, of course, happen in dialogue and it's a part of the process. But it is a process. So those disagreements, while they might exist, do not account for all of engaging in dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And another question for you, Fatima, and then because we have a bunch, I'm going to move on to questions for Riya and come back.
Yeah.
But so are there particular experimental constraints that worked in seeds that might be difficult to apply to everyday communication with people outside of our moral communities?
So there are obviously experimental constraints. Seeds started off as an experiment, but I don't necessarily think that the constraints we have at Seeds need to be applied into the real world. So, for example, when you engage in dialogue, you don't. It's like a summer camp. You go completely away from the world in like this nice wooded place in Maine with a scenic view and a lake, and you usually are in a completely different world. You're not thinking about back home when you have the conflict. For a lot of people, it's the first time they're traveling outside of the country, and so being cut off from the real world really allows you to be present. And there's a reason why we don't have dialogue in like a crowded city like New York, where you're like constantly things happening around you. But I don't necessarily think that should take place when we engage in dialogue in our real lives, because being cut off makes the re-entry problem more prevalent, because when you go back, you're suddenly hit again with the stereotypes and the news you're exposed to back home and the narrative you're exposed to back home. So having dialogue in your real world where you're engaging every day with these forms of media and these narratives, and you're having them questioned simultaneously, I think that's much better than being cut off. So I don't necessarily think the experimental constraints that we have at Seeds need to be implemented outside.
Great. Thank you, Fatima. Okay, moving on to some questions for Riya. So Riya, how do we as historians appropriately infer claims about personal relationship from official correspondence?
Thank you for this question, whoever asked it. It is a very great question, and I would love to go deeper into it. So what I can say about inferring claims from personal correspondence is based on my personal experience. So I looked at the personal correspondence of JFK and Nehru. And so these were letters that were in fact not revealed to the public for 20 years, and their existence was denied. So why did that happen? So in these letters, they took place during the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Nehru asked JFK for aid. He told him the situation was very dire and they needed aid, otherwise India would be severely compromised. So this was so remarkable, and this was such a surprising question because it deviated from Nehru's policy of non-alignment. He prided himself on not relying on the United States and Britain, and this one deviated so much from that. So what I inferred from this was that he had a lot of pride in being only India and not exactly aligning with other countries. So to build a successful relationship like he had with US at the time, it would take a lot of like moving above this pride and rising above these pride and personal tensions for him. And that is what I mainly inferred from this correspondence. Thank you.
Great. And I think in your answer, you maybe answered part of this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So why did India not seek assistance from the Soviet Union during the crisis with China?
So this is where kind of Galbraith comes in as a factor. So John Kenneth Galbraith, I said he was the US ambassador to India during the time. So during this crisis and during his time in India, he'd established himself as a well-known and a well-educated and a very great person because he had a reputation of being a great economist. So he had many talks with Nehru and with Indian officials, right? So he had already a reputation, and when the crisis happened, he immediately stepped up. He put himself out there and he spoke to Nehru and he advised Nehru and he advised the defense minister about this. So Galbraith had a huge factor in this. So this kind of put US as a helper to India in a very visible view. So US was already just like there, right up there. So this kind of immediateness and Galbraith putting himself out there probably prompted Nehru to ask aid from JFK because it seemed like an obvious solution at the time because of the establishment that Galbraith had built. Thank you for this question also. It was great.
Wonderful. So next question for you, Riya. How did JFK deal with, if at all, Pakistan and thus Pakistani-Indian relations?
So thank you for this question. It has like a great background and I would love to go into it. So in fact, there was a Pakistan visit to US in 1961, where JFK and his wife had taken the Pakistan Prime Minister Ayub Khan to Mount Vernon, and they had charmed him and they had engaged in lots of diplomacy, and that had been a very successful visit. And now going to the 1962 Sino-Indian War, there was a huge chance of Pakistan siding with China in this. And the moment Pakistan came into the equation against India, then that would be very fatal for India. India would not be able to stand it. And Galbraith and Kennedy knew this and they thought of it. And if they were going to help India, they had to do it in two ways. And Galbraith says this in his diary, that his main focus was divided in getting aid for India and in engaging with talks in Pakistan. So they kind of wrote letters to Ayub Khan and spoke to the Ayub Khan, and the US ambassador in Pakistan also engaged in this, so that they said, please stay away from this war, because that's not that would be very fatal towards India. And so they kind of use this past Mount Vernon experience and the diplomacy experience to kind of put themselves out there too, and make sure that Pakistan didn't interfere in this war.
Great, thank you. Okay, one final question for you before we move on to the questions for Elizabeth. Great insights on the foundation of the foreign policy towards promoting democracy. How do you think the subsequent years have been? Was similar strategy followed again?
Okay. Thank you to the person who asked me this question. It's a great question, and I would love to tell you more about it. So actually, in the subsequent years, this is where, when I talked about how foreign policy is representative of its head state, this is so greatly shown in the subsequent years. Because with JFK and Nehru, they had a good relationship, and it was a huge high in US-India relations. But after that, they, as we all know, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Nehru died a few years later. So Lyndon B. Johnson and Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister of India after Nehru, both of them did not have a good relationship. Indira Gandhi was much more distrustful of US than her father was, that's Nehru. And LBJ was not so open towards India and was not so outgoing towards India as JFK was. And these were their personal views. And because of this, the framework that had been built with JFK and with Nehru didn't continue forward. It dropped, it completely dropped. So this shows us that this is how the relations were after. And it just, again, highlights the importance of the heads of state.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, we'll move on to some questions for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, first question, what made you interested in Alzheimer's disease? What are you most looking forward to in terms of new research coming out in the field?
So in 8th grade, I had to pick a topic in science to research. And I chose Alzheimer's disease because when I first heard about it, I was pretty young. And I just got really scared because I was like, oh my gosh, this terrible disease can basically take people away from themselves and destroy their personalities and who they are. And I just really got interested in it because I wanted to see if there were ways that I could help people and maybe in the future develop treatments. And treatments are kind of what I'm looking forward to in new research from Alzheimer's. There's actually a drug that came out a few months ago called aducanumab. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. And what it does, it's supposed to remove amyloid plaques from people's synapses and neurons. And so I was really excited when I found out about that because it seems like a huge step in combating Alzheimer's disease.
That's amazing. I hope that they come out with more drugs like that, or that one works. So next question for you, Elizabeth. Is more sleep always better for preventing Alzheimer's disease, or are there diminishing returns once you hit between 8 to 10 hours?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think in my research, I think I found maybe one paper that talked about this. And if I remember correctly, it said that after a certain point, there were diminishing returns, but there weren't any negative effects. So it wouldn't be that if you slept too much, you would have more amyloid beta. It would just be no more amyloid beta would be cleared out. So, yeah.
Got it. So a good plug to get 8 to 10 hours every night. Great. One more question for you. With education gradually spreading its coverage, is Alzheimer's disease seeing a declining trend overall?
So actually the opposite has been happening. There has actually been an increase in the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm not really sure about why this increase is happening. I'd have to do more research, but I don't think that it's because of an increase in education. I think it would mainly be an increase in the separation between social classes. So I think right now in the United States, there are much more people who have low socioeconomic status than there were even like 20 years ago. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. That is shocking and scary. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so we have 10 questions left, so I'm going to do a lightning round in the 10 minutes that we have left of this session. I'll go in order. For Fatima, why center national identity in particular?
So when you enter a dialogue space, entering a space with all of your different identities, because we're not just one person, but having national identity central to it, especially in a conflict, in a dialogue which centers around conflict, like say India, Pakistan, or India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, means that we interact from that space of understanding that there's like an inequity in power and there's an imbalance in power. So to better, if we had, say, for example, where national identity was decentralized and there wasn't an emphasis, you'd see the opposing group as more heterogeneous and have more interpersonal relationships, but that would ignore like the core conflict issues. And a way to understand this better would be maybe not in a conflict dialogue, but in a dialogue between someone from a first world country and someone from a developing country. Having dialogue which doesn't take that into account diminishes the kind of privilege that that the person from the first world country holds versus someone who isn't from a first world country. And then having dialogue without acknowledging that privilege and without acknowledging that the national identity that's present, that harbors to that privilege, would be remiss. That wouldn't be equitable dialogue. That would be unequal. So yeah, that's why.
Thank you, Fatima. For Riya, how much of US-Indian relations is defined by the existence of China? If China didn't have a sphere of influence, what do you think India relations would look like?
Thank you very much for this question. It's so important. So one major thing is that the relationship would be so different if China hadn't existed, because as I've said in my presentation, one of my main arguments was about the 1962 Sino-Indian War, right? When the border dispute happened and US gave support to India. So if China wasn't expanding its influence, or if the border dispute had not happened, then US wouldn't have the opportunity to publicly give aid to India, which was a very historic moment. So if this hadn't happened, then the US-India relationship that I have been talking to you about in the entire presentation would be completely and totally different. So this relationship is so majorly influenced by China. And thank you for the question.
Wonderful. For Elizabeth, is there any way to reap the beneficial effects of nicotine without smoking that might be useful for Alzheimer's disease?
That's a really interesting question. I think I haven't come across any drugs or research about this, but I imagine that maybe in the future, nicotine could be made into like a pill or an injection or something, so that you don't have to smoke to get nicotine. But also, nicotine is kind of addictive, so maybe medicine developers may be kind of hesitant to release an addictive drug to the markets.
Great point. For Riya, how did the India-US relationship impact the India and Russia relationship at that time?
So thank you for this question. The way I see it and the way I understood is that the US-India relationship was a very visible and public relationship. So everyone knew about it. It was in all the newspapers, and it was kind of like the dominant relationship with India at the time. So this kind of subdued the India and Russia relationship with the USSR. But in fact, a fact is that after the 1962 Sino-Indian War, the Russia and India relationship evolved because of this, and that's when the US-India relationship kind of subdued. So after Kennedy's assassination, so it's either like one relationship is prospering while the other is not, or the other one is prospering while the other one is not. So that kind of situation was occurring in the 1960s.
And still today. Thank you, Riya. For Fatema, what kind of questions would you like to take up next in this line of research?
It's a good question. I'd have to think about that one more, but I think what I researched this time was very interesting because I got to look at my own experience from seeds and look at it in a more critical way and think about things I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't done my research on seeds and the way dialogue plays out in real life. But I am also very interested in the same pool of like dialogue, how different like power inequalities play out in the real world when we interact with each other, especially when it comes to say things like colonization. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to look at that kind of stuff a little deeper.
Very, very interesting. Well, we hope you keep us posted on your next questions. Question for Elizabeth. How do you think socioeconomic status can be enhanced? As we know, in India, we have politics influencing the lower income sessions to such an extent that everything is promised as free. Do you see politics of free electricity, free water, etc., is a good way to enhance the socioeconomic status of these low income groups?
So I think that free healthcare and free like organic food and also better programs of education can be helpful, but that's easier said than done. Because at least in the United States, there are a lot of opposing views on making these things free. So I think that it would be very beneficial for these things to improve socioeconomic status, but I think that it may not be possible.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Question for Riya. I loved your research and the presentation style and the confidence you showed, and it was very evident that you've spent a good time understanding your topic. I would like to ask, how do you see India-US relations developed over the past years as we know, Russia supported India during the nuclear test in 1998? Also, how do you see India-US relations in light of the Russia-Ukraine war, as Russia is standing against all NATO nations and openly telling not to interfere? If the world moves to World War III, what do you think India will support?
Thank you for this question. It's like so huge. I can't begin to answer, but I will try. So talking about the relationship after the Nehru era, I think I've elaborated on that in the past questions, is that it declined. And when it comes to the Russia relationship, I've also summarized that, saying that it's either US India or US Russia. Like it doesn't work both ways, at least so far. So now when it comes to like the present situation, like we all know that India has taken kind of like I would like to say neutral stance with this thing. They haven't exactly put forward their opinion right there. And that is like going forward the policy of like not interfering. So that's what has happened so far. And the final question about the World War III, that is a very difficult question for me to answer, but yeah, I will try to get back to you on that after I've done adequate research to build up a hypothesis and things. But thank you very much for this question. It's made me think so much.
Of course, totally. All right, for Elizabeth, any ideas about how to reduce the reluctance of low socioeconomic status people from using healthcare services to which they have access?
So as I said in my presentation, this reluctance, at least in the US, I assume is from the high cost of healthcare. So if healthcare costs were reduced, and maybe a universal healthcare, like for free healthcare was set up, this reluctance would be lower.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, final question. Riya, what inspired you to take up this topic?
Thank you for this question. I think I was asked one more like it, and I would love to answer it. So, as an Indian, I am obviously very invested in this relationship and the foreign policy. And now when it comes to the history part of it, I am a very interested student in history. And US history was something that really stood out to me. So when I was looking at the topic, I tried to combine like how can I combine my heritage and my culture and my knowledge of India with my passion for history. And this kind of came up. And then after more and more digging deep into this idea, I looked at US-India relations. And this is so applicable because a lot of people I know are studying in the US, are living in the US. And the idea of like doing something that would influence them and that would influence me and that kind of puts forward two of my main interests was just like, it was a very good topic. And it was a perfect topic for me to take up. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Riya, Elizabeth, and Fatima for answering all of these questions and for your wonderful presentations today. We are at time, so I am going to end this session, but wonderful, wonderful job to all three of you. You're all so impressive, and we hope that you join us in a few minutes for our keynote speech. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.